Hi, welcome to episode 90 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we all live in, we're using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whidden, here in Brooklyn, New York, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. Today, I'm so very delighted to be joined by Paul Reeve, who lives about 1,970 miles due west of me in Salt Lake City, Utah, where he is a professor and chair at the University of Utah's Department for History and Mormon Studies. We were connected by Michael Green, who was a guest in episode 88. So thank you to Michael for connecting us. And thank you, Paul, for joining me today. How are you doing? And could you share a bit of your story?
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. Like you mentioned, I'm the chair of the history department at the University of Utah. I grew up in southern Utah, a very small Mormon village, spelled hurricane, but pronounced hurricane by those who live there. My dad was a cattle rancher on the Arizona Strip, so my hometown was just 18 miles from the Utah-Arizona border, and the cattle that my dad grazed were just across the Utah-Arizona border. So I grew up branding cattle, riding horses, and went eventually to college at Brigham Young University in Provo for my bachelor's and master's degrees. And then I received my PhD at the University of Utah, where I currently work. My first job out of the PhD program was in Virginia. So moved with my young family to Virginia in 2002. In the meantime, the chair of my PhD committee was doing his workouts at the field house on campus at the University of Utah, had a massive heart attack and passed away. I was his last PhD student to graduate, and as things played out over the next couple of years, the department hired me to come back and take my mentor's position. So that brought us back from Virginia to Utah in 2005. My mother still lives in southern Utah, where I grew up, in the house that I grew up in. She's 94. So we visit there quite often. It's about 20 minutes from Zion National Park, my happy place. My ancestors were sent to southern Utah by Brigham Young in 1861 as a part of what was called the Cotton Mission. When the Civil War broke out, he's trying to build a religious kingdom, but also an economically self-sufficient temporal kingdom as well. And with the price of cotton going up, he thought, there's a warm climate in southern Utah. Maybe we can grow enough cotton to provide our own needs. And so my ancestors were among those who he sent to southern Utah to grow cotton. It didn't work. There were no sort of large-scale, cotton fields, although they did grow cotton, they did produce bales of cotton, but never enough to even, provide their own needs. Anyway, so that's a little bit about my story, where I came from.
Wow. How I guess if I recall correctly, doesn't the Mormon Church does keep really good genealogical records, so that's why you're able to kind of know so clearly your family story.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, has a fantastic family history library in downtown Salt Lake. People come from all over the world to search their genealogical records. People do family history vacations to Salt Lake City. And I'm talking about people of any faith or of no faith, right? You don't have to be a Latter-day Saint or a Mormon, the more popular term, to visit the library. It's open for anyone, but they have collected records from around the world. And so, yeah, great resource as a historian, right? For doing research, no matter the research topic, it's a fantastic library, but people generally come there to do family history research. And my own family story is well documented. Latter-day Saints do a great job of record keeping. So, it makes it available to understand this history. Yeah.
What's the connection between, I guess, the church and this idea of like being able to have so much information? Maybe no other church necessarily has, no other, I guess, faith really has that kind of those kind of records.
Yeah, so there's a theological connection for Latter-day Saints. So Latter-day Saints, the founder of the faith, a man by the name of Joseph Smith, introduces this notion in Nauvoo, Illinois, of baptisms for the dead, not disinterring bodies, right? But if your ancestor, your grandmother, your mother, or whatever, uh, you know, died and they didn't encounter the Latter-day Saint gospel message, you can actually serve as proxy and be baptized in behalf of a deceased relative. Um, it doesn't mean Latter-day Saints don't believe that then means that they are somehow now Mormon in the afterlife. It means they are giving them that opportunity, right, to accept or reject. The Latter-day Saint gospel is grounded in the principle of agency. Everyone has agency to choose for themselves, but we're going to give them this gift, is the way that Latter-day Saints view it. We'll perform this proxy baptism, and the ancestor has passed away. Latter-day Saints believe, they continue to live as spirits, and baptism is a physical and earthly ordinance or sacrament that they will participate in for deceased ancestors. To give them that opportunity, it solves the for Latter-day Saints. They believe then this solves the question of Christian exclusivity, right? That you need baptism to be a Christian, or you're somehow damned in the next life. But then that's just determined by the happenstance of your place of birth, right? And Joseph Smith says, "Hey, here's the solution," right? um, you can actually provide this gift for your deceased relatives. And so that touches off this desire to search out your own ancestors
Mhm.
so that you can perform these baptisms for your deceased ancestors. And so Latter-day Saints amass all these records, and there seems to be sort of, an innate desire amongst all human beings, right, to figure out who they are, where they came from. And so they make those records publicly available for everyone to kind of satisfy those kind of desires to learn about their own family history. But for
It,
Latter-day Saints, there's a theological connection.
Okay. No, it's interesting because as you're talking about this, and as I'm thinking about, I guess where you live, one of the things that I find that's, I guess, lacking, I think, in this day and age is like one. I mean, and it's pretty well, I guess, discussed at least, is that we've lost that sense of like kind of community, and it seems that that's not necessarily something that is as much of a problem maybe when you have that kind of tight community, but also the idea of like connection to your ancestors. Um, it's one of the unique attributes of being an American is that we're not weighed down by like centuries of like traditions. You are able to kind of reinvent yourself. You are able to kind of, you know, be your own person and maximize what you can do. But I think like one of the things I've noticed when I think about like, my life is like the standard, I guess, life plan for somebody is like you work hard and then you have to retire to a retirement community in Florida. So if like you live in New York, a lot of people then their parents retire to Florida, so you lose the benefit of that. Um, those ancestors really almost right. You lose the benefit of that connection to your ancestors. So I don't know. That's just kind of things that are running through my mind. But is that? Is that are the am I right to kind of understand that in your faith and in your community you still do have those strong bonds?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I teach a course called Mormonism and the American Experience. Uh, so it's an academic course, right? And I'm at a Research One public university. So it's not about the truth claims, right? It's about this religious tradition. And one of the things that I try to help students understand, especially situate the founding of the Latter-day Saint faith in time and space, right? Upstate New York, 1820. There's a market revolution going on, and it's sort of animated by materialism and individualism. And one of the things I try to help my students appreciate, right, is that for Latter-day Saints, community supersedes the individual in every sort of way possible. It's a rejection of life as a Darwinian struggle of all against all. Even those who might be financially unfit, they should still survive, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's bound up in the Latter-day Saint ethos. So after the Latter-day Saints arrive in the Great Basin and start building a community in 1847 in the Salt Lake Valley, they set up what's called the Perpetual Emigrating Fund. It's a micro loan system so that there are thousands of converts in Great Britain and Northern and Western Europe, right, who have converted to the LDS faith. Joining the LDS faith in the 19th century is more than changing where you go to church on Sunday. It's
Mm-hmm.
a gathering to this new gathering location. And if you can't afford, migration is expensive. If you can't afford the ship's passage and the wagon, outfitting into the Salt Lake Valley, we have a loan for you, a
Mm-hmm.
perpetual loan. Uh, so you can immigrate, you can bring your family, and then after you get established, the ideal is you pay back the loan. That provides money for someone else to immigrate. So that's the perpetual part of the Perpetual Immigrating Fund.
I
So
see.
I'm just sharing that as an example of articulating the very point that you just made. Community supersedes the individual. The very way that Latter-day Saints established themselves and set up their villages in the 19th century, all centered around community. So Salt Lake City is marked off from Temple Square, and you emanate out from Temple Square, and it's this vast grid system. The Latter-day Saints superimpose their ideals of order and unity on the landscape. And every village that you go into in Utah, to the present, I tell my students, okay, how do we know if this was a mining community established, by miners who are looking for the wealth that the American West promises is out there, or established by Mormons, right? I can tell you within 30 seconds of arriving in this town if it was a morning established by the Mormons or by miners. And it's the grid system. And they have at the center of the grid the meeting house, right, where it would often double, at least in the 19th century, as the schoolhouse, and then the church on Sunday, the social gathering place, Sunday school, all of those kind of things are happening. And then the grid emanates out north and south, east and west. And you're 100 south, that means you're 1 block south of the meeting house. 500 south, 5 blocks south of the meeting house. 500 west, 5 blocks west, right? You know on this grid system where you are. And the fields where they farm are outside of the village square. So it facilitates unity and social interaction. And you compare that to what's going on in the Midwest during the same time period. It's this line version of settlement where the farm is established and the next neighbor is maybe 5-6 miles away. And the house is located next to the field, and that's where you farm. And then your next neighbor, several miles away. So Latter-day Saints are using this village pattern of settlement that just simply illustrates the point that you made. Community is more important than the individual.
Now, um, one thing I noticed you mentioning, like the grid, when I was in Salt Lake a few years ago, and I remember looking out our window, and it seemed to me like that the electrical wires were hanging from poles that looked like the cross. And I thought that was just interesting because and I've seen lots of like poles holding electrical wires. I'd never noticed how clearly something could look like a cross. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but um,
Yeah, probably not. So Latter-day Saints don't. In the 19th century, they did use
uh,
the symbol of the cross. In the 20th century, there was this theological kind of movement, sort of suggesting, we embrace the living Christ. The cross sort of focuses on his death. We believe he's
mhm,
resurrected. And so you don't see on Latter-day Saint chapels or
uh,
temples crosses, even though
uh,
they believe, like they fully accept themselves as Christian, right? They
mhm.
articulate themselves as followers of Jesus Christ. Um, they tend to not use the symbol of the cross as much as other Christian traditions do.
Okay, all right. Now, what distinguishes, I guess, the Church of Latter Day Saints, like the faith, from other, other like either Catholicism or other Christian religions? Is it? I mean, the sense of community seems to be pretty unique, because you don't get that from other religions necessarily as much. But what are the other, like, kind of like tenets that are different, that really
Yeah,
distinguish it?
yeah, it's a great question. So, um, religious scholars suggest that Latter day Saints don't necessarily fit into the broader rubrics that within which we divide Christianity. So there are Catholics who say, we trace ourselves back to Peter. He's the founding pope, right? And so we are the primitive Christian church that continues to exist to the present. And then you have Protestants who have protested against Catholicism and broken off and formed their own traditions. And sort of it's usually, in response to the hierarchy and rituals and those type of things. And Latter day Saints come along, the founder of the faith comes along, Joseph Smith, and he says, look, we're not Protestant, we're not Catholic, we're a restoration tradition. He articulates the notion that the primitive Christian church eventually fell into error and what he called apostasy. And it lost what he called priesthood authority. And so he claims that he's a restoration tradition. He's restoring the primitive church, that God gave him priesthood authority. In fact, he claims that Peter, James, and John, as resurrected beings, appeared to him, laid their hands on his head, and gave him priesthood authority to reconstitute the Church of Jesus Christ, right? And because it's the latter days, it's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter days. So Latter day Saints see themselves as a restoration tradition, restoring primitive Christianity, bringing it back. It fell into error. So they say we don't fit the Protestant. We're not protesting against Catholicism. We're restoring primitive Christianity. So religious study scholars will label it a restoration tradition. There are other traditions that are even in the 19th century, such as Alexander Campbell, claiming, right, they're going to restore New Testament Christianity. Joseph Smith doesn't stick just to the New Testament. He will go back to also the Old Testament for inspiration for some of the things that he introduces. And he also describes the Christian creeds. So Christianity has come up with a variety of creeds by the time that Joseph Smith in 1820 or 1830 is founding the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He calls those creeds an abomination. So this does not win him friends and influence people amongst existing Christians, right?
Mhm.
He sort of throws out what has been accepted as, hey, these are the things that define us as Christians, and he sets them aside almost immediately. And he will define a physical and anthropomorphic Godhead. So the Trinity, he says, yeah, we believe in God the Father, in his Son, Jesus Christ, and in the Holy Ghost. But God the Father is separate from Jesus Christ. They're not three in one. They're three in one in purpose, but they're physically distinct. God has a body as physical as man's, and the Son also, and the Holy Ghost is a personage of spirit. That's what Joseph Smith said. And once again, that's distinct from the rest of Christianity. So the rest of Christianity will look in on the Latter-day Saints and say, you're a non-Christian cult. right? And that continues to the present. So the rest of Christianity tends to not accept that Latter-day Saints are Christian, not because they think Latter-day Saints don't believe in Christ, but because the Latter-day Saints don't accept everything that the rest of the Christian community has concluded this is what it equals to be a Christian, right? Yeah, there's tension.
Mm-hmm.
Latter-day Saints say, yeah, we baptize in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. We accept them as a part of our Godhead. We just don't believe they're three in one. And
Mm-hmm.
that violates the Nicene Creed, right? So they have sort of distinct beliefs like that that will set them apart and create tension between them and the rest of Christianity. Now, they cooperate in the present, in interfaith kind of events, charity, humanitarian work, all of those kind of things. But there are some things that are theologically distinct. So when Mitt Romney, for example, ran for president, a evangelical minister in Texas said, he belongs to a non-Christian cult, right? So those kind of ideas have never disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we might have common ground on moral issues. Some Christian ministers, especially evangelicals, will say, but theologically we're different. So that kind of is how it looks in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm. The one of the things, like, for me, one of the things I grapple with for a while as I watched, like, the cultural and political tensions in our country in the last few years, is like, how do you coexist with people who are not just seeing the world differently, but like live in different worlds, right? Like, we all, like, your existence is different than my existence. And the only thing that I could settle on, as I did like these almost like kind of like mental experiments, is I felt like if we engaged everybody with like curiosity, compassion, respect, and humility, it really doesn't make a difference what we believe in. Like, obviously, one might try to persuade somebody to think their way, but as long as you're engaging them with those principles, we can all get along. Um, I kind of throw that as a thought, but also because I realize, as you're talking about, your church, it seems like you kind of can get it from different directions, right? Like in New York City, the Book of Mormon is a big Broadway play, and it kind of pokes fun at your church. But then also on the other end, you've got evangelicals who are also critiquing and like denying your kinship as a Christians. So,
Yeah,
and I know that the founding of Utah was, I mean, the religion was a big complicating factor, wasn't it, in statehood?
yeah, definitely. Yeah. So that's a lot to think about. I loved what you shared. Like, one of my mentors passed away recently, and I attended his funeral, and I loved what his son said. He said, "My dad had this gift of greeting people with curiosity rather than judgment." And what you just articulated, I think that absolutely matches. And I want to make that sort of a guiding principle for me, to greet people with curiosity rather than judgment. Right? Uh, we all come from different backgrounds, different belief systems, and I'm curious, right? I'm curious about what the world has to offer, rather than dismissing other belief systems with judgment and scorn, right?
Mm.
So I love that, and then um, yeah, so Utah gets sort of the existence of the state, right, gets uniquely tied to this religious group, unlike most other states in the nation, um, into the present, right? So religion still kind of shapes life in Utah, even though the percentage of Latter-day Saints in the state has gone down. Salt Lake City itself is predominantly more not Latter-day Saint than it is Latter-day Saint. The surrounding county, Salt Lake County, roughly 50-50, right? But there's still this dominant presence in the state, right? The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints wields enormous power in the state. Latter-day Saints arrived in the Salt Lake Valley when it was northern Mexico in July of 1847. They are deliberately fleeing the United States because, they have been expelled from various locations. They were driven from the state of Missouri in 1838 under threat of a state sanctioned extermination order. The governor of Missouri said we must expel them from the state or exterminate them, right? And some Latter day Saints are killed in this process. They arrive in Nauvoo, Illinois. Eventually, the leader of their faith, Joseph Smith, is murdered in 1844. Those who killed him are not held accountable because they're deemed as doing the community good, right? Like they have provided a service to the broader Hancock County community. And so the leadership falls to Brigham Young, and by 1846, he's looking outside, or even before that, 1845, he's looking outside the bounds of the United States. It seems like the process is going to play out again. He concludes that we should look for a space that's outside of firm state control or firm governmental control. They actually talked to Sam Houston in Texas, which is an independent nation at that point, right? Hey, you got space for us there, right? Looking at Oregon, which is, the boundary dispute with Oregon and Great Britain, right? So that's unsettled, and maybe that's a good location. They eventually zero in on the Salt Lake Valley. It's northern Mexico at the time, and Mexico has really loose control of its northern frontier. They don't have any settlements there. They don't have infrastructure, anything to kind of take control of it. And so Latter-day Saints, as early as 1845, are articulating the Salt Lake Valley as a potential site of relocation simply because it's outside of firm governmental control. And when they have settled where there are existing settlers, they conclude, right, that this has not worked to our advantage. This obviously ignores the fact that there are native peoples in what will come to be called Utah territory, right? So the Ute, the Shoshone, the Goshute, the Southern Paiute, the Navajo all occupy this land. And like elsewhere, as Euro American settlers move in, Native peoples are dislocated, and that also happens with the Latter Day Saints. But they arrive in July of 1847 in northern Mexico. The U.S.-Mexican War is going on, and within 7 months, they find themselves back in the bounds of the United States because the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo cedes the land on which they arrived to the United States. And so what was the Mexican North becomes the American West. And you're absolutely right, Michael. Then from basically 1850 to 1896, they apply 7 times for statehood. They are rejected 6 of the 7 times. They are repeatedly told you are un-American. You don't fit prevailing definitions of what it means to be an American, and you will not be admitted into the sisterhood of states until you abandon polygamy and theocracy. Those are sort of the kind of conditions that Congress continually repeats to the Latter-day Saints as they continue to apply for admission. So in terms of population, they have the population, right? Things that would have allowed the surrounding territories to be admitted as states. Utah's land base continually gets whittled away until where it is, in 1868, it takes the shape that it currently has. As surrounding territories and states are admitted, Utah is whittled away and, held out of the sisterhood of states until 1896.
Wow, it was determination.
Yeah, and they abandoned polygamy, right? So
Yeah.
they give that up in 1890. It takes a while for it to die out, actually, in practice. Latter-day Saint leaders say, "Look, we have made marriage covenants with our wives, and we're not going to walk away from that. We just won't engage in new plural marriages." So, it takes a while for the existing plural marriages to die out, but in 1890, they begin that process. And the LDS faith starts to excommunicate people who engage in future plural marriages by like 1904, 1910. And that's the policy they continue to the present,
Mm.
right? You have to be married monogamously. You can't be married polygamously to be a member of the LDS faith today.
Okay. Um, to go to the present day, I was so curious when you first started. You said that you used to brand cattle.
Yeah, yeah.
Were you like? Did you? I mean, were you going to school full time and then just kind of doing work on the ranch with any free moments? Is that how it worked?
Well, so I grew up. I grew up doing that when I moved away for college. My dad kind of had a hired hand who would do sort of more of the day to day kind of things, and yet my brother, when we were in close proximity, we would go down for branding in the spring, so that the calves are born in the spring, and then you brand them, um, you dehorn them, you castrate the bulls, you put ear tags in them, the whole 9 yards, right? Like it's a pretty kind of complicated process. So yeah, I would go down and help out with that, when I was in school. But when I lived there, it's just sort of like daily, farm chores.
Mm.
My dad, um, my dad was 1 year from finishing his bachelor's degree. He was in accounting, and his dad, my grandfather, said, "I need you to come home and help out on the farm." And he always regretted not getting his degree.
Mm.
And the way that he addressed that for us as kids, me and my brother, every year he would give us a steer as a 4-H project steer, and we would break it to lead. So, you put a harness on it. My friends are like walking their dog and I'm walking like this 800-pound steer, right? It, it's not cool. Like it gets no social credibility at all. Even in Hurricane. I mean, but then you would take it to the county fair. You wash it, shampoo it, cut its hair, rat its tail, this whole thing. You show it in front of the judge. Then you take it to the regional fair. And at the end of that, you take it into the ring and you auction it off. And, grocery stores and different community supporters would bid up the price because they wanted the kids to have, a good price for their project. Steers, there would be lambs, there would be pigs, right? All at these regional fairs. And my dad never gave us a dime of the proceeds for that. Like, he didn't even take us to ice cream, right? Afterwards. That money went into a bank account. And I resented it as a kid. But when I got to college and my college was mostly paid for, I understood the wisdom in it. He was providing a college education for us by giving us these project steers every year. Eventually ran out of money. My last year and a half, I took a job as a 7-Eleven clerk, the swing shift, to work my way through the rest of my bachelor's degree. But, he provided that for me. As an adult, I think he was brilliant. As a kid, I hated having a
Yeah.
project here to deal with every year.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was sort of my childhood growing up.
And
We
how
had a
big
milk.
was
Sorry, go ahead.
how big was your town?
Um, Roughly, I think, gosh, I'd have to go back and look. When I was growing up, like about 3,000 people. There were
Okay.
72 kids in my graduating class. It's much bigger now. A lot of growth has taken place. Utah, the last 20 years, one of the fastest growing states in the nation. The economy is really good. And so people are moving to Utah, right? Silicon slopes, all kinds of jobs and opportunities in the state as a result. But when I was there was a four-way stop. Now there are stoplights. So it's changed. It's changed pretty dramatically from when I was there. But yeah, like I think around 3,000 or so when I graduated from high school.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the the terrain of Utah is not necessarily the most hospitable. Is that right? I mean, even like the Salt Lake, like when I went to Salt Lake City, like the city itself isn't on the lake. And I think if I understood correctly, it was because it doesn't smell very good, and I'm not sure what else was going on there, but
Yeah,
is that
no.
correct? I mean, I know it's beautiful for the Olympics, and I know there's good things about it, but it's
Yeah.
not intuitively hospitable.
Yeah, no. So pretty harsh, desert climate, semi-arid environment, and so Utah is one of the most people might not sort of make this connection, right? And I'll explain. And even my Utah history students, so I teach Utah history every year at the University of Utah, right? And even those who have grown up here don't sometimes understand sort of the settlement pattern and how it's dictated basically by the land, right? So roughly 84% of Utahns live along the Wasatch Front. And it's basically the western edge of the Rocky Mountains. So yeah, skiing and everything fantastic in Utah. And you can get to the ski resorts in 20 minutes. So the majority of the population, 84% of the population, lives along the Wasatch Front, basically where water comes out of the mountains.
Mhm.
And yet there's all this land out there. Why didn't Utahns spread out? Right? Unoccupied land. The Homestead Act made it relatively cheaply available, and yet people didn't go out and claim it because you can't make a living on a 160-acre homestead in the salt desert, right? So the northern part of the state is called the Great Basin because there's no drainage. So the rivers that come out of the mountains in the northern part of the state drain into the Salt Lake, and it's a mineral soup, right?
Mhm.
Because there is no outlet. And you have the salt desert that is the residual afterlife of ancient Lake Bonneville. You can't grow crops there, right? It's like just covered with this crusty salt. And so, you have all kinds of land in Utah that is not occupied. The federal government has military bases here. And during World War II, Wendover Air Force Base was where the bombing crew that dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki trained, because they would carve out of the salt desert, life-size replicas of Japanese aircraft carriers for the bombing crew to fly over and, drop practice bombs on, all right, to train, because there's just all kinds of land. So the federal government is the largest single landholder in the state of Utah. It wasn't given out by or taken up by homesteaders because you can't live there. Um, then the rest of the population, right, is spread out in these Mormon villages where water does come out of the mountain. But we all pile up along the Wasatch Front. It makes Utah the eighth most urban state in the nation, which sounds counterintuitive, but the Census Bureau measures that by percentage of population that lives in an urban center of 100,000 or more.
Mhm.
And because the population then lives, 84% of us live along the Wasatch Front, it makes us the eighth most urban state in the nation.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's fascinating. We when we visited, we went up to the Spiral Jetty,
Uh
and
huh.
that was that was probably the most surreal landscape I've ever seen on Earth.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It is, right? And you can understand why no one's living there. You couldn't farm. Um, and Utah's economy in the 19th century was basically agriculture for the Latter day Saints. And then those who weren't Latter day Saints went after mining, right? The mineral wealth. And we have one of the largest copper mines in the world, across the Salt Lake Valley. Park City was founded by miners, right? That's a mining community, and the roads there intersect at all kinds of odd angles, not the grid system, right?
Mhm.
Uh, the roads lead you into the mines in the mountains. So Brigham Young would instruct his followers to stick to agriculture. He was afraid of the boom bust cycle of the mining frontier. And so he would say, leave the mineral wealth to the outsiders, and the outsiders, those who weren't of the LDS faith, then that tended to be their segment of the economy, and Latter Day Saints would farm. So, yeah, I mean, the history once again kind of intertwined with the religion. And it kind of helps to explain how Utah's economy in the 19th century developed. And then by the 20th century, the mining communities, the mines have played out, and those mining camps have been remade as ski resorts.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
and the tourist industry, right, like draws people to Utah. So 5 national parks, all kinds of wonderful skiing and hiking, and all of those kind of things.
mhm. Is there a cultural collision between all these tourists coming and the LDS faith? Like,
Yeah, so I mean, I always talk to my students about this. By the end of the semester, I have them read an article called "Culture Shock," and then we just have a discussion day where students can, share their own experiences. And Mormon or non-Mormon seems to divide life in Utah to the present, right? Are you a part of the faith, or are you not a part of the faith? And then people make up their minds about you, and it continues to exist today. And so I have students who will, share horrible experiences like growing up in Latter Day Saint neighborhoods, and the Latter Day Saints, the mothers of the Latter Day Saint kids saying you can't play with that kid because he's not a Latter Day Saint, right? Like so. Um, that sense of community can feel safe and secure if you're on the inside, but if you're an outsider, right, it can feel exclusionary.
yeah,
And even though Latter day Saint leaders preach against that kind of nonsense, right? Latter day Saints still engage in it, right? Like this exclusionary behavior. Um, so I'll just give you one example of how it kind of plays out. So uh, July 24th, 1847 is the day that Brigham Young arrived in the Salt Lake Valley, and it is a state holiday to the present, right? So July 24th, state holiday. It's called Pioneer Day. So a very large parade takes place in downtown Salt Lake. There are rodeos, there are community celebrations across the state. In the 19th century, they started celebrating in 1849 by setting off cannons and gunfire and right parades and all of those kind of things. And it just continues to the present. For those who don't feel like that's their thing, or it's celebrating anything that they have, a connection to, uh, they have adopted their own Pioneer Day celebration. They call it Pie and Beer Day. And they will meet, have beer, and enjoy pie. And that has become the, counterculture Pioneer Day celebration, to mirror the Latter Day Saint Pioneer Day celebration. And not to say that there aren't people who aren't Latter Day Saints who don't participate in Pioneer Day, because there are, right? They have embraced it as a part of like the state and everything. But there is a distinct sort of counterculture, right? Like if you have moved in here, and this dominant faith sort of and culture kind of dictates life in this state, it's sort of natural to respond against that in some sort of way, right? And so the Pie and Beer Day is the counterculture example to the Pioneer Day.
yeah. I mean, it would be hard to. I'm thinking like it's one of the things about like New York City is it's very hard, I think, to kind of penetrate into the city, like to kind of get your place. And one of the things that I think makes sense for New York is I think like in the national dialogue, one of the things that can easily lead to a very like heated discussion is the idea of like identity and how you identify and blah blah blah. But New York City is like a city of 8 million people. And if you think about going to like a big university, like, University of Utah, or like, any big university, you can get lost in those numbers unless you figure out who's my tribe, who's my crowd. And the way you do that is you start thinking about what's my identity, what's my niche. So in New York City, when you have 8 million people and everybody's looking to kind of, find their people, you start slicing and dicing yourself until you find that identity group that makes you feel at home. because otherwise you're just one of 8 million, and that's a very daunting proposition. So I don't say there are other reasons for it, but I think as a matter of survival, frankly, that's I think why in New York you can be so hyper focused on your identity, because it is a matter of social survival. And obviously it doesn't necessarily apply when you're out of New York City, but I think that kind of feeds, I think, some of the um, I guess awareness, the hyper awareness of that kind of issue more than it might come up in other areas.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of comparison, and I think that's exactly what's going on here, right? It's uh, perhaps plays out a little bit differently simply because there is this sort of dominant culture, right? And so then there's this counterculture. But I think that's exactly right. Like people are looking for a place to belong, right? Like
Right.
they want to find their people, right? Like how do you fit in? And if you're not a part of, the metaphor is sometimes the hive. Utah is the beehive state.
Yeah.
And that's a metaphor that the Latter day Saints used. It's on the state symbol, it's on the state flag, it's all over the state capitol, right? It's on Utah Highway Patrol's patch, arm patch. Like the symbol is the beehive. And um, it means industry, it means order, and everyone has a space in this hive, right? And it's very busy and it's productive and everything, and everyone's taking care of each other. But if you're on the outside of the hive,
Yeah.
right, you're going to have to find space for yourself, right, to fit in and find a sense of belonging. And I think that's what absolutely takes place
Yeah.
in Utah.
Hey,
Yeah.
what if you're a butterfly?
Yeah. Right.
You
Yeah.
kind of you're out of luck. Um, so
Yeah.
what's an ideal day off for you?
Ideal day off. Oh gosh. So, I mean, the thing that I love about Utah is we are incredibly close to the mountains, and outdoors is a way that I sort of make a connection, have where I get a sense of awe, right? Like being in the mountains. So, ideal day off is going to start with a hike in the mountains with my wife. We're 10 minutes from a hiking trail that we go to frequently, but if I have more time, I'll go to a different hiking trail. And just an appreciation of the beauty, the sort of the wide open spaces. Gretel Ehrlich, who writes about the American West, has a book called The Solace of Open Spaces. And I've read that book several times, like because it speaks to me that I find solace in the open spaces of the West and being, in the mountains, hiking or mountain biking. That's sort of an ideal day off for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I found something. I mean, it sounds weird, but sometimes I find solace actually just sitting on the subway reading a book while
Yeah,
surrounded by people.
yeah. No, I love that.
If I can get a nice corner seat right next to the door, and I've got like 10 or 15 stops, like it's actually like a nice little like 15 minutes of just reading a book. I try not to read my phone anymore. There's too much of the same stuff.
I hear you. Yeah, I love that.
And so like when I was in, we were in Utah for two different parts of our trip a few years ago. So we started in Salt Lake City for a few days, and then when we came back, we stopped at Bear Lake and we did like a little glamping for a few days.
Yeah.
And this is, I mean, these are only the most minuscule of like exposures to the state, but it was all very like captivating and beautiful.
Yeah, and that's what I love about the state. The various geographies.
Mm,
So three geographical provinces kind of come together, and the Colorado Plateau, sort of where I grew up, and that's where the five national parks are, right? Like Zion National Park, Arches, um, Canyonlands, Capitol Reeve. I mean the and Bryce, like the stunning kind of geographic formations are just. I think they're the best in the world. I know I'm biased because I grew up here, but like I said when we started, Zion National Park is my happy place. I grew up doing hikes, going on picnics with my family to Zion National Park. hiking there, backpacking there, and my wife and I still love to go down there and do that. So
Mhm.
um, the beauty in Utah, I think, is absolutely stunning.
Yeah. Actually, for me, probably the most memorable thing I had when we were there was when we were driving, I think from Bear Lake back to Salt Lake City for our flight home. We had to stop on the highway for whatever the road was, because it was a shepherd with like a herd of sheep. And like I have seen that once when I was like in Spain, but like just to have this kind of like biblical scene unfold while we're in our like a rental car trying to go home, going back to the airport was was just so cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can encounter that in rural Utah, right? Like people moving their sheep herds or sometimes cattle, right? If they're moving them from one grazing spot to another, and they have to go along one of the more rural roads, like you could get caught in like a cattle drive as well. So yeah, that's very much a part of life in Utah for sure.
It was like a sheep jam, like sheep jam. It's like,
Right.
and like I saw like this 18-wheeler, and everybody's just sitting there waiting. Like this is, it's like it was really wild.
Yes. Yes.
So, um, so what would like do you are there? I mean, from your perspective, do you think that there are misperceptions of either people from Utah or people that are LDS or Salt Lake City that you wish was better understood or clarified, or corrected?
Yeah, I guess there are probably a few things that exist in public perception. One we talked about is polygamy, right? That Latter day Saints are polygamous, that people in Utah, or the majority, I guess, or that everyone is polygamous. Like I said, the mainstream Church of Jesus Christ of Latter Day Saints abandoned that practice beginning in 1890. There are offshoot groups to the present that do exist in the state. They're not members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter Day Saints, but there's fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter Day Saints or United. Apostolic Brethren, right? There are a variety of offshoot groups who trace their roots back to this 1890s period where they said, oh, we're going to cling to polygamy, and the mainstream church abandoned it. So those offshoots do continue to exist in the state. There's sort of, just a lack of understanding, and sort of pop culture kind of likes to hyper focus on the
Yeah,
polygamy thing.
yeah,
Um, there's also perceptions about race and racism, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter Day Saints from 1852 to 1978 did not ordain people of Black African ancestry to its lay priesthood. And so there is racism absolutely bound up in how that developed and played out over time. Um, uh, but the founding of the faith under Joseph Smith, there were no racial exclusions. There were black men ordained to the early priesthood under Joseph Smith. Brigham Young implemented these racial restrictions, and sometimes the public perception is that they continue to exist to the present, or that black people are not Latter Day Saints or Mormons. All of that's false. There have been black Latter Day Saints from 1830 to the present. The founding year of the faith, the first black Latter Day Saint joined the faith, and there have been black Latter Day Saints ever since. I run a digital project at the University of Utah called Century of Black Mormons, where we are naming and documenting every person baptized into the faith of Black African ancestry from 1830 to the present. There was never a prohibition against joining the faith. For a time period, there was against ordination to the lay priesthood, and that was lifted in 1978. There are according to a BYU sociologist, over 1 million Latter day Saints of Black African ancestry around the globe. The Latter day Saint faith is doing really well in Africa, but Brazil, other global locations, right, as well as in the United States, African American Latter day Saints. So they are here, they're present, they are part of the Latter Day Saint faith, and sometimes the perception is otherwise. I'm trying to think. other perception, that everyone is a Mormon in Utah, right? If you go outside of Utah and people ask you where you're from and you say Utah, I almost guarantee you the next question is, are you Mormon, right? And over the last 20 years, the percentage of those who are identify as Latter-day Saint has decreased, both by an influx of outsiders, but also, you know, Latter-day Saints leave the faith, right? They no longer identify. And so, it's more diverse than what people might imagine. The largest uh, minority group in the state are Latinas, and it's fastest growing minority population in the state. Um, so I think maybe uh, those are some of the perceptions that continue to exist about Utah.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. And I guess like I would say for New York to I like I think one of the things is people I think maybe it's more also explanatory. Like New Yorkers have the reputation of being very abrupt or always rushing, and I would like to say one that if we're rushing, it's because we're far more dependent on like mass transit. So if you're ever rushing for the subway and you see the doors closing on your face, it's so maddening and because you have to wait 10 minutes maybe for the next one, or if you're rushing for your train home like on the using the train lines, it could be like an hour. So I think New Yorkers are a rush, but if we're rushing it's because of that dependence on mass transit, so where like 1 second could mean an extra 10 minutes. So I want to provide a little context for why we might be like that. But the other thing I think for New Yorkers is I think that it's similar maybe to even you were referring to like pop culture perception of the LDS, but like New York City, you either see all the wealth or you see all the crime. And there's so much like just kind of like in the middle. I mean, the city has its problems, and there certainly is crime, and there's certainly wealth, and and everything in between. It's not an easy place to live, but but it has its own merits, and I think that what I want in like say branching out like with this podcast or anything is like more just trying to understand other places, and you don't have to like it. I don't have to love Salt Lake City, but I have to understand why others would love it and respect that. And I think that's all I'd ever want for people to come is like just come to New York. I mean, yes, there's problems everywhere, and we can be hypocrites, we can be whatever, but everybody can be that way. We're all very very fallible, but people like it, and there's strengths to it, and there's weaknesses, and it doesn't have to be for everybody.
I love that. Yeah.
So
Yeah. No, completely agree. Right. And it goes back to sort of the point that you made earlier, right? Greeting people with curiosity rather than judgment, right?
yeah,
Getting to know them, out of a genuine sense of curiosity, right? I think that's a good life lesson in terms of approaching people, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Is there any food or dish that's like a quintessential Utah dish?
Oh yeah. So
Ah,
this
nice.
this goes back to the Olympics, right? So this is also a part of sort of Mormon foodways and Mormon culture. There are a couple of things that sort of get played up in sort of stereotypes about Utah foodways, but I think Latter Day Saints usually embrace and laugh about it because they understand that it's true. So for the Olympics in 2002, there were Olympic pins that got traded, and the most popular Olympic pin was the green Jello pin. Utah consumes the most Jello of any state in the nation, and green Jello with shredded carrots. Um, I grew up eating it. Like it is a thing. And that pin, Olympic pin, was the sought after pin. Like in Salt Lake in 2002 for the Olympics, there was a green Jello pin that by far was what everyone was trying to collect. And then the other sort of cultural food that gets associated with Utah are funeral potatoes. So once again, community, sort of dominates. And if someone passes away in a Latter Day Saint community, um, the congregation will provide a meal for the bereaved family, right? So you have the funeral, and then the family goes to the cemetery for the burial ceremony. And then they would come back to the meeting house, the chapel, right? There's always a gym associated with it, and the tables are going to be set up there, and there will be a meal that is provided for the family. Um, on behalf of the congregation. So the congregation is going to, people are going to bring in food and everything. And one staple that becomes associated then with those meals are funeral potatoes. And there's a recipe like called funeral potatoes, right? They're actually really good, if I could just say that. Um, but it gets played up in sort of like popular stereotypes about Utah foodways. So
Okay.
green jello with shredded carrots and funeral potatoes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Do you have a funeral potato recipe you can share?
Um, I can certainly get you one. I don't
I
have one
can
off the
find
top.
online. I can
Yeah,
find
yeah, yeah.
online.
I could definitely send you one. Yeah, at home. Yeah, happy to send you one.
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
Sure. We can
yeah,
have that.
definitely.
We can feed. We can keep your tradition started here in Brooklyn.
Yes, yes, yeah.
I had a guest a few episodes ago who she grew up in Nebraska, and she said that one of the things that it was a treat for her growing up was not just to me. Like, I just had discovered tomato sandwiches with like mayonnaise, and I think that's sublime. But she said she grew up having tomato with peanut butter and bacon,
Oh,
um,
wow.
which I had never heard of before. I'm trying to have an open mind, so I did make that, and it was. I don't know that I'd make it again, but it's not because I didn't like it; it just didn't resonate. But it was
Yeah,
fine.
yeah, yeah.
So
Now I'm gonna have to try that too. Yeah.
yeah,
I grew up like you with like mayo and
yeah,
tomato and lettuce and bacon, right? But
yeah,
never peanut butter.
yeah. Well, the peanut butter, I guess, made sense because I mean, it wasn't as bad as you'd think because, like, in some respects, tomato. I mean, tomato is a fruit, right? So tomato has that kind of acidity of like jelly a little bit, and it's got some of that sweetness. So it wasn't as much of a weird thing. But I will try a funeral potato sometime. So thank you.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
before we wrap up, can I ask, like, what gives you hope?
Yeah, I'm a historian, and so I guess what gives me hope are people that I've encountered in the past who respond to sometimes really horrific kind of life challenges out of concern for the good of the whole over individual needs or wants. I think of people like um, uh, George Washington, for example, who at the end of the Revolutionary War turns over his sword to the Continental Congress, right? Gives up power, which is atypical in sort of world history, and then he's called back into service, elected president twice, and then steps down. Right? There's no requirement. Like he would have been reelected three,
Yeah.
maybe four times. Like who knows, right? Um, uh, you know, John Adams is of a different political party than Thomas Jefferson, and when Jefferson wins, John Adams gives up power.
Mhm.
Um, he walks away, right, peacefully. Like the peaceful transfer of power is like unique, not the norm in world history, right? Um, so people like Frederick Douglass who respond to the horrors of growing up in slavery, with this desire to make the world a better place for other people. So those kind of people, in historical actors who are willing to stand up for what they believe to be right, out of a sense of integrity and a sense of goodness for not just themselves, right? Not just thinking of themselves, but for other people. In Utah history, I've studied the legislative session in 1852, in which the legislature passes a black servant code. There are converts to the Latter day Saint faith from the South who are enslavers, right? And some of their enslaved people are also baptized Latter day Saint, and they are brought to Utah territory. And the legislature has to decide what to do, what laws will govern this relationship. And one legislator says we should not legalize this in any sort of way, right? This is 1852, and he says we should actually grant Black men the right to vote in 1852 in Utah Territory.
Uh-huh.
And he's really standing by himself, and he takes a principled stand and gives a fantastic anti-slavery speech. So people like that give me hope. People like that who are willing to sort of set aside their own self-interest and act for the good of the whole. I see those examples in history, and that is what gives me hope in the present, that there are good people amongst us willing to take principled stances and kind of respond out of the good of the whole, rather than their own self-interest. And so I think for me, that continues to give me hope for the
Mm.
future.
Great. Well, this conversation it reinforces my own hope for everything, and I appreciate the chance to talk with you, and I appreciate your willingness, your willingness to have this conversation, because it's been very illuminating, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. It's been fun for me as well. So
Yeah,
thanks.
and thank you to all the listeners out there. May you go out and explore our country with curiosity, respect, compassion, and humility. All right. Thanks so much, Paul.
Thank you.